Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we streamline the most critical research into the knowledge you need without the jargon overload. Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're tackling something genuinely huge, a global study. Really, so ambitious it feels almost like an international scientific coordination effort.
It really does.
This paper pulls together, hundreds of experts across every inhabited continent, building this definitive baseline for aquatic biosecurity. We're digging into the results of screening, I think, over 800 species.
That's right, 819 taxa, technically.
Right, taxa, to figure out which ones pose the biggest invasive risk, not just now, but, and this is the crucial bit, under future climate conditions.
And that forward-looking part, that's exactly what makes this study so important. It moves beyond just good science into, well, essential global policy guidance.
Because these invasive non-native species, invasives, they really mess things up, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. They can fundamentally change whole ecosystems, the genetics, the structure, everything. And the economic damage, often severe. We're talking billions globally.
Billions, wow.
Yeah. And up till now, our response has often been, a bit localized or maybe too reactive after the fact.
Right, patching things up after the horse is bolted.
Exactly. So this study offers the alternative, a really rigorous, standardized global method. It helps guide policy, helps resource managers everywhere prioritize where they spend their limited funds, focus on the biggest threats first.
And the tool they used for this standardization, it's called the Aquatic Species Invasiveness Screening Kit. Let's just call it the screening kit, maybe.
Good idea, yeah. The screening kit. ASISK, if you see it written down.
Okay, the screening kit. And they use this across, 15 different groups? Fish, mollusks, plants, even reptiles.
15 groups, yeah. Across all sorts of climate zones, too. That's how they built this genuine global risk baseline. It's quite an achievement.
Okay, so the stakes are clearly massive. But before we dive into the kit itself, let's paint a picture of the enemy, so to speak. If you're a manager, say, looking after a river basin in South America or maybe a coastline in Europe, what makes a species highly invasive? What are those red flags?
Well, you're basically looking for biological superstars. Organisms that are just fantastic at colonizing and surviving in new places.
Super performers, I like that.
Yeah. The classic high-risk profile usually includes several key traits. First off, reproduction. How often and how.
Right.
We often see species that breed really frequently, maybe multiple times a year, where they show something called oviviry.
Which means?
It means the young develop inside the parent and are born live. They don't just release vulnerable eggs into the water, so the offspring get an immediate head start, survival-wise.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
The species also tend to be larger physically and live longer, so you combine that robust reproduction with a long lifespan. And populations can just explode and really hang around.
So tough organism, breeds fast, lives long. What else makes it likely to take over?
Adaptability.
Yeah.
And opportunism. They need to be able to switch diets easily, exploit whatever food is around. They often have a track record, a history of successful invasions somewhere else. That's a huge predictor.
History repeats itself, even with snails and fish.
Pretty much. And crucially, they need broad environmental tolerance. They have to handle big swings in temperature or salinity, maybe even pollution levels, much better than the native species that evolved there.
Got it. So the smart move isn't to launch a massive, costly investigation into every single new organism that pops up, say, in ballast water.
Exactly. No, the first step is this rapid screening, hazard identification, really, just figuring out which ones might be trouble and need that full, detailed risk assessment later on.
And that's where the screening kit comes in.
That's its sweet spot. It's multilingual, which is important globally, and taxon generic, meaning it works for almost any type of aquatic life. It was adapted from some really successful earlier tools.
Like a Lee one.
Yeah, the weed risk assessment for plants, which is used everywhere, and the early fish invasiveness screening kit, SISK. The great thing is, by building on those and including these sort of minimum requirements for assessment, the kit meets tough regulatory standards like the EU's, so the results are immediately useful for policy folks.
What blows me away reading this, though, is just the scale. They weren't just looking at one region, were they? They were aiming for the whole planet.
Absolutely. They wanted the broadest possible global database, and the numbers show it. They did 1,730 individual screenings.
1,700. Wow.
Covering 819 different taxa species, subspecies, hybrids, even whole genera sometimes. And it took a huge team, 195 assessors, they're all co-authors, working across 120 different risk assessment areas, or RAAs.
Okay, hold on. 195 assessors, 120 assessment areas.
Mhm.
That really does sound like a UN science project or something. Across all 6 inhabited continents. And these RAAs, they weren't just country borders, right? That wouldn't make much sense ecologically.
No, and that's key. They were smart about it. They defined these areas based on what makes sense for invasions. Sometimes it was a big region or a country, but often it was more ecologically relevant, like a specific lake or an entire river basin, or defined a marine region like, say, the Mediterranean Sea.
Why is using something like a river basin better than just, say, France?
Because water connects everything in that basin. The risk spreads through the water, right? Not according to lines on a map. So a species' ability to establish and spread, that depends on the river network, the connections. If you calibrate a risk score for the whole Mediterranean, it's just more biologically meaningful than only looking at the French coast or the Italian coast.
Right, the ecosystem doesn't care about passports.
Exactly. So this approach, this granularity, let them develop really meaningful, tailored thresholds, not just for the type of organism, but for the kind of environment it might land in. And that huge scope, that's what gives the results we're about to talk about their real weight.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts. How does this screening kit actually work? How does it turn the biology of, say, that red-eared slider turtle or a gibel carp into a number, an objective score?
Right. So the protocol itself is based on 55 questions, standardized questions. And they're split into 2 main parts, 2 modules. The first one is the basic risk assessment, the BRA. Let's call that the current conditions score. That's the first 49 questions. And they focus purely on the species biology and history under today's environmental conditions.
What kind of things are they asking in those 49 questions? Is it all diet and breeding?
It's a good mix. Biogeography, like where does it come from? Is its native range huge, suggesting it's adaptable? Or is it very restricted?
Okay, adaptability is key.
Definitely. Then there's biology, reproductive strategy, we talked about that. Diet flexibility, does it hybridize easily with native species? Stuff like that. It's all based on known evidence, especially its track record of invasion elsewhere.
Okay, so that's the baseline. But then comes the really innovative part for planning, right? Looking ahead.
Exactly. That's the second module. The climate change assessment, or CCA. Let's call it the future climate component. It's just the last 6 questions, but they're crucial. They evaluate how predicted future climate changes based on climate models are likely to affect that species invasiveness.
How does it do that?
Well, crucially, it looks across the whole invasion process. Will warming help it get introduced? Will it make it easier for it to establish a population? Will it help it spread faster? And will it increase its final impact on the ecosystem?
Ah, so it breaks down the climate effect across those key stages. That's clever. So warming, maybe changes in rainfall, salinity shifts, those could affect each stage differently.
Precisely. And the scoring reflects that. The potential score range is pretty wide. The BRA, the current condition score, goes from -20 up to 68. Add in the CCA, the future climate component, and the total score can range from -32 all the way up to 80.
And a low score means low risk.
Generally, yeah. A score below 1 is usually considered low risk. The higher you go, the higher the risk classification. But, it's not just about the number itself. The really important safeguard here is that for every single question, the assessor has to provide not just an answer, but also a justification based on evidence and, crucially, a confidence level.
Right, the confidence level. That stops people just guessing. You have to back it up.
Exactly. It's ranked low, medium, high, very high. And across this whole massive study, all 1,730 screenings, the average confidence level came out at 2.73. That puts it solidly between medium and high confidence.
So nearly 200 experts looking at the evidence were generally pretty confident in their answers. That's reassuring.
Very. It suggests the results are built on a robust evidence base, not just speculation.
Okay, but a raw score, say, 45. That's still just a number. A policymaker needs clear categories. Low, medium, high. Where do you draw the lines? That's calibration, right? How did they figure out those exact tipping points?
Yeah, calibration is absolutely essential. You needed to turn that continuous score into something actionable, like high risk. So what they did first was create a kind of gold standard list. They took all 819 species and categorized them before the screening started a priori as either known invaders or known non-invaders based on their history elsewhere in the world.
So they build a reference library of known good guys and known bad guys.
Essentially, yes. And that took a huge amount of work digging through massive databases like FishBase, CIBI's Invasive Species Compendium, the Global Invasive Species Database, plus tons of scientific papers. Once they had that reliable history for each species, then they brought in the statistics to find the best cutoff score.
And this is where it gets a bit technical, but it's important for trusting the results. They use something called ROC curve analysis, receiver operating characteristic, and Uden's J statistic. Can you break that down? What does that math actually do?
Okay, think of it like tuning a radio. The ROC curve helps you find the perfect frequency, the perfect score threshold. You want to set that threshold, maybe it's 18 points, maybe it's 25 at the exact spot that does two things best. Maximizes your ability to correctly identify the known invaders, that's your true positive rate, and at the same time minimizes the number of times you wrongly flag a harmless species as dangerous. That's your false positive rate.
So you don't want too many false alarms, but you absolutely cannot afford to miss the real threats.
Precisely. Set the dial too low, you cry wolf too often, set it too high, and dangerous invaders slip through the net. Uden's J is basically the statistical method that points to the single best sweet spot on that dial, the score that gives you the best balance, the best discrimination between the invaders and non-invaders.
Got it. So it's not arbitrary. That threshold number is statistically the optimal place to draw the line, based on the historical data.
Exactly. That statistical rigor is why these thresholds are so reliable for managers. They're evidence-based dividing lines.
Okay, so they built this powerful, calibrated engine. What did it actually find? Which alarms went off? Looking at the paper, it seems like fish and invertebrates got screened the most. Is that just because there are more of them?
Well, partly, yes, but it's also down to a couple of things. First, expertise. There just tend to be more experts available who study fish and invertebrates. And second, they genuinely make up a huge chunk of the species being introduced around the world, especially into places like European waters where there's been a lot of monitoring. So it reflects both expert availability and the reality of introductions.
Right. Now, here's where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit scary. Let's talk about that climate signal. That seems like the absolute killer finding for anyone thinking about future policy. When they compared the score with climate change factored in versus the score without it,
Yeah.
what did that difference, that delta value, reveal?
Yeah, this is probably the single biggest takeaway. The finding was, well, pretty dramatic. A huge 68.8%, nearly 70% of all the species screened showed a positive difference. Their score went up when future climate was factored in.
Whoa. So for more than 2/3 of potential invaders, the risk actually increases in a warmer world.
That's what the data points to. It strongly suggests that climate change isn't just a background issue. It's actively going to make the invasion problem worse for the majority of species we already know about.
That is quite staggering. Why? Why is a changing climate seemingly so beneficial for these invasive species?
It loops right back to that high-risk profile we talked about earlier, that broad environmental tolerance. Climate change means, generally, warmer average temperatures, yes, but also things like changes in river flows, maybe more floods, more droughts, increased salinity near coast because of sea level rise, just generally more environmental disturbance.
Okay.
For native species, these rapid changes are often huge stressors. They're adapted to the old conditions. But for those hardy invasives, the ones with wide tolerances, these changes can actually create opportunities. They might operate better at slightly higher temperatures or handle disturbances that knock back the natives. It essentially lowers the ecosystem's natural defenses, its resistance to being invaded.
So climate change kind of tilts the playing field in favor of the invaders. Okay, beyond that climate signal, how confident can we be in the overall accuracy of these scores? Did the tool actually work well?
Yes, the confidence is high there too. They looked at something called the area under the curve, the AUC value, from that ROC analysis we mentioned. For most groups, the AUC values were well above 0.5, which statistically confirms the toolkit is good at telling the difference between species known to be invasive and those known not to be. It made accurate predictions based on their biology.
And the nightmare scenario for a manager is missing a big threat, right? The false negative, letting a truly dangerous species get classified as low risk. How did the kit do on that front?
That's probably the most critical metric from a management perspective, and the results were excellent. The number of false negatives, so genuinely invasive species that the kit wrongly scored as low or medium risk, was exceptionally low. Across the different groups, it ranged from 0% to only about 5.6%.
0 to 5%. That's really good.
It's incredibly good. It means managers can trust the results. When the kit flags something as high risk, it's very likely a real threat. And just as importantly, when it classifies something as low risk, it's very unlikely to be a major invader slipping through unnoticed. It provides that confidence needed for rapid triage.
Okay, so they did the calibration, they found it was accurate. What about the actual thresholds? Did they manage to set those definitive risk cutoff points for most groups?
They did. They successfully calculated statistically solid thresholds for 14 out of the 15 organism groups. They couldn't really do it for bacteria and fungi because the sample size was just too small. We'll come back to that. But for everything else, yeah, the global benchmarks are now established.
And what was the pattern there, especially thinking about climate change?
Here's the kicker for policy. For most of the really high-profile group, reptiles, amphibians, freshwater fish, marine fish, tunicates, the threshold score needed to be classified as high risk was actually higher when climate change was included, the BRA plus CCA score, compared to just the baseline score, the BRA score.
Wait, hang on. The bar for being considered high risk is literally set higher when you account for the future climate. What does that actually mean for a manager today?
It sends a really clear signal. It means the level of risk we consider acceptable has to be recalibrated now in light of future conditions. If we only screen based on current risk, we might classify a species as, say, medium risk, but that same species might be solidly high risk in 20 or 30 years because of climate change.
So relying only on the current risk score is potentially dangerous.
Potentially very dangerous. It means policies around things like importing species for the pet trade, or aquaculture, or fisheries. They really need to use that higher future-adjusted threshold, BRA plus CCA, to make decisions today. We have to manage based on the threat level that's coming, not just the one that's already here. It demands preventative action on those future high-risk species right now.
Right, let's name some names. Out of all those screenings, which species really jumped out? You mentioned 33 species ended up in the very high-risk category.
That's right, 33 in total. And interestingly, 26 of those were rated very high risk based on both the current conditions score and the future climate score.
So they're bad news now, and likely even worse news later.
Pretty much. They are inherently risky invaders, and warming just seems to amplify that risk. And again, as we discussed, that ability to handle a wide range of temperatures, that thermal tolerance seems to be the absolute key driver for many of them.
Why does being flexible with temperature make such a difference for future risk?
Well, it essentially future-proofs them against warming. If a species is already tropical or just naturally has a very wide temperature range it can live in, then when you add the points from the future climate questions, its score naturally goes up. It's perfectly positioned biologically to thrive as things warm up. The changing climate isn't a stressor for them, it's potentially an optimizer.
Okay, let's look at a few of the rogues gallery members that hit this very high-risk list. The red-eared slider turtle, you see those in pet shops everywhere.
Ah, yes, Trichomes striptoscripta, a classic example. It's native to the southeastern U.S., which has quite varied climates itself, so it's already evolved to handle a decent temperature range.
So it's pre-adapted.
Exactly. When it gets introduced elsewhere, could be a city pond in Europe, could be an irrigation ditch in Asia, it finds habitats it can exploit. It's scored high because it's proven it can survive relatively cold winters and then breed successfully when things warm up. It's just very adaptable.
What about fish? You mentioned goldfish earlier. Surely they're just harmless pond fish.
Well, goldfish, Carassius auratus, and their close cousin, the gibel carp, Carassius scubilio, are incredibly tough. They scored extremely high because, frankly, they've already invaded almost everywhere and thrived. They can handle really degraded water quality, low oxygen. We find them established from northern Finland and Poland right down to the Mediterranean, Australia, the Americas.
Wow, okay. Not so harmless then.
Not ecologically, no. Their sheer persistence and ability to survive where native fish struggle makes them inherently high risk, especially as conditions change.
Okay, shifting to the oceans. The common lionfish. That one's made headlines for its rapid spread.
The lionfish, Pteromiles, is almost the poster child for a marine invasion gone wild. It's spread in the Western Atlantic, and now the Mediterranean has been incredibly fast. Unprecedentedly rapid is the term used.
Why is it so successful?
It's a combination. It has venomous spines, so few predators in its new ranges. It eats almost anything voraciously, and it reproduces really frequently. The high score reflects its known ability to just explode in numbers and cause major ecological and economic damage to fisheries.
And one more, the channeled apple snail. This one's a big agricultural problem, isn't it?
Huge. Pomacea canaliculata, native to South America, but it got spread globally, partly through the aquarium trade, but also deliberately for aquaculture, which backfired spectacularly.
How so?
It's a major pest of rice paddies, just devastates the young plants. And it outcompetes native snails, so its score reflects that combination. Human help in spreading it, the pathway, plus its own high reproduction and adaptability equals a global scale threat.
Okay, so many of these top threats are flexible about temperature. The study predicted this would lead to range shifts. How does that work? Where are they expected to move?
The main prediction is a clear move towards the poles, poleward expansion. As the planet warms, species that like heat, tropical species, find that the temperature barrier that used to keep them out of temperate regions starts to disappear. They can now survive further north in the northern hemisphere or further south in the southern hemisphere.
And temperate species move too.
Yeah, similarly, species from temperate zones might find they can push into areas that were previously too cold, more continental regions perhaps. This whole process is a major reason why the invasion risk is predicted to increase, particularly in those temperate zones that used to be sort of buffered by cold.
What about the species that like the cold, the specialists?
They're likely the losers here. Cold water species, especially those with narrow temperature tolerances, could face real problems. They might see their ranges shrink dramatically, push further and further towards the poles or up mountains until potentially they run out of suitable, cool habitat. It's range recession for them.
And the study gave a specific example with marine fish, right? Saying temperate areas might see a bigger increase in risk than tropical areas. How does that work?
Yeah, that was a really interesting detail. For marine fish, when they calculated the risk thresholds, the score needed to qualify as high risk was actually higher in the temperate ecoregion grouping compared to the tropical one, both for current conditions and future conditions.
So temperate zones are judged by a tougher standard.
Not exactly tougher standard, but the increase in risk seems disproportionately focused there. It suggests temperate regions are really on the receiving end of this poleward movement. As their waters warm, they become newly suitable for lots of tropical or subtropical species moving in. So you get more potential invaders arriving, increasing the overall pressure and risk in those temperate systems. They become these biological melting pots, facing new arrivals while their own native species might be stressed.
Okay, this is clearly powerful stuff. If I'm running a conservation agency or managing fisheries, what's the bottom line? How do I actually use these rankings and these calibrated thresholds day to day?
The absolute key is efficient risk triage. That saves money and helps protect ecosystems more effectively, because we know the tool is very unlikely to miss a major threat, that low, false, negative rate managers can act quickly and with confidence. The rankings basically let you sort potential invaders into 3 main management streams.
3 streams. Okay, what are they?
First, rapid action. These are your very high-risk species. If they're detected, they need immediate attention eradication if possible, or at least containment and control. No delay.
Okay, top priority. What's next?
Second, species that score in the medium to high risk range. They become the top priority for a full, comprehensive risk assessment. You need to dig deeper into their specific biology and potential impacts in your local context. The screening flags them as needing that closer look.
Makes sense. And the third stream?
This one's about prevention. Restriction or banning. This applies to species flagged as high risk that aren't yet loose in your environment but might be coming in through trade. Think ornamental fish, aquarium plants, species used for stocking fisheries. This toolkit gives regulators the evidence to say, nope, this one's too risky, we need to restrict its import or ban it altogether before it becomes a problem.
So it helps plug the gaps proactively. And it sounds like a huge benefit is that even areas without much local data can use these findings.
Exactly. That's the power of the generalized thresholds. Look, not every region, not every country has the resources or the data to do its own massive calibration exercise like this global study did. Maybe they only screen 1 or 2 species.
Right.
But now they don't have to start from scratch. They can reliably use these global thresholds, the ones calculated for specific organism groups like freshwater fish or maybe by climate class, to get a really good idea of whether a species is likely high risk or low to medium risk in their area. It kind of democratizes good biosecurity practice. It extends the usefulness of the tool everywhere.
That's a massive advantage. Now, that future climate component is clearly powerful, but predicting the future climate itself, that's notoriously tricky, isn't it?
Yeah.
What kind of challenges did the assessors face trying to factor that in?
Oh, Immense challenges. And the paper is quite upfront about this. An assessor isn't just looking at one simple prediction, they're juggling a whole range of complex information. Different greenhouse gas scenarios, like, the very high emissions RCP 8.5 versus a much lower one like RCP 2.6. Which one do you use?
Yeah, that alone changes the outcome significantly.
Massively. Then you have multiple global climate models, and they don't always agree perfectly, especially at a regional level. Plus, you might be looking at future conditions that have no direct comparison today, these non-analog climates. How does a species react to something it's never experienced? It involves a lot of informed judgment.
So a fair bit of uncertainty baked in, just by the nature of prediction.
Absolutely. And the paper also highlights that range shifts aren't necessarily smooth, steady movements. You get extreme weather events, a sudden severe cold snap maybe, or an intense heat wave that can really knock back a species' expansion or even temporarily reverse it. So the actual movement can be quite jerky back and forth, not just a straight line poleward. Trying to capture all that volatility in just 6 questions is, well, it's inherently difficult.
Right. Okay, you mentioned earlier, and seems like a really important gap, that they barely screened any bacteria or fungi. Only one bacterium, zero fungi. That feels like a huge blind spot.
It really is. It points to a major disciplinary limitation in how we currently approach biosecurity risk assessment, certainly within this project's scope. We have pretty good handles on plants, fish, insects, mollusks, the macroorganisms, but the microbial world, almost completely missed here.
And that's worrying because
Because we know that invasive bacteria and fungi can have devastating impacts. They cause diseases in native plants, fish, amphibians. Think of chytrid fungus in frogs, for example. They can completely restructure ecosystems through disease.
so if we're serious about a global assessment framework, we can't just ignore the microbes.
Absolutely not. The study clearly flags this need for much greater multidisciplinarity. We need microbial ecologists, plant pathologists, fungal experts deeply integrated into these kinds of risk screening efforts. Otherwise, we're potentially missing a huge piece of the invasion puzzle, a really dangerous piece.
Okay, so looking forward, putting it all together, what's the single most immediate practical action that should come out of this study for policymakers?
Get that list of 33 very high-risk species onto the radar of every single relevant management agency worldwide. Right now, these species need to become top priorities for biological monitoring programs everywhere.
Why focus on monitoring?
Early detection is everything. The simple truth is, the earlier you detect one of these high-risk species when it arrives in a new place, the better your chances of actually eradicating it successfully and affordably. Once it's widespread and established, it's often incredibly difficult and expensive, maybe impossible to remove.
So find them fast.
Find them fast. And we should be supporting this with the best available tools, like developing and deploying things like eDNA surveys, environmental DNA. That lets you detect the presence of a species just from water samples, even when the organism itself is rare and hard to see. It's about using cutting-edge science to make that early detection possible, to prevent the next big invasion before it takes hold. #tag outro.
Well, this really has been a deep dive into a truly landmark study, a huge international effort that's given us this global, calibrated baseline for aquatic invasion risk. It feels like a fundamental shift, moving away from just reacting towards genuine prevention.
I agree. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, what this massive collaboration does is empower local managers everywhere. It gives them reliable, evidence-based global thresholds. It shows that a tool like the screening kit is valuable and trustworthy even if you don't have the resources for a massive local calibration study. It means biosecurity decisions, even in really data-poor regions, can now be underpinned by top-tier global science.
So what does this all mean? It means we have a much sharper tool now. We found that that perfect dial setting you mentioned, statistically speaking, a tool to help us spot and hopefully stop the next major aquatic invasion before it really begins, especially under the growing pressure of climate change. It's about protecting those vulnerable native ecosystems more effectively.
But it also leaves us with that critical question, doesn't it? That point about the missing microbes, the fungi and bacteria. Given how much damage we know they can cause, think aquatic diseases wiping out fisheries or amphibians, it really makes you wonder how much of the true global invasion threat is still effectively invisible to our current assessment systems. What do we need to change structurally to bring microbiology fully into this vital global biosecurity effort? That's definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.